Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom takes on a little bit of a new meaning this week. On this Shabbat, we find ourselves in the midst of a violent conflict that started in Jerusalem and has spread all over Israel and to the West Bank and Gaza. As members of Jewish communities with family and friends and many deep connections, there is fear for Israel and her citizens. Concern as people take cover in bomb shelters and hear rockets fly above them. We mourn the 7 people who have died so far in Israel, including a soldier and a 6-year-old, and 523 wounded from when I checked last. As members of a human community, no matter what our political beliefs, we also acknowledge the pain on the Palestinian side, the loss of victims caught in the crossfire. So far, a total of 122 people, again, my numbers could be off based on Shabbat, but from when I checked last, including 31 children who have died since the escalation on Monday, and at least 900 people injured. We find ourselves like the psalmist who cried out to God in agony and desperation, when will the fighting stop and peace come? SAJ is not a monolithic community when it comes to Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have members all over the map and all over the alphabet, as it were, of the varied Jewish community organizations and responses to the upticks in violence. Some of us are ourselves Israeli and experience this very different than the rest. This is not abstract, it is our home and our family. Some of us feel that Israel is one of, if not the most essential parts of our Jewish identity. Some of us may not feel connected very much at all, and this also leads to a sense of confusion and not being sure about what to make of these current events. So for some of us, our connection to Israel leads us to great pride. And for some of us, our connection to Israel can also lead to feeling ashamed or feeling in protest with some of Israel's actions, not just now, but at other times as well. With all this great diversity, which is a source of pride at SAJ, today I hope that we can find something we all can agree on. Something each of us, no matter where we stand politically on the current or overall situation, can speak out against, b'kol echad, with one voice. And that is the dangers of extremism on all sides, and our obligation as Jews to condemn extremism, including the extremism that comes from our own people and our own community. This topic is not, even if we might think it's not a modern one or even a pre-modern one, it's something that has been on the minds of those who have shaped communities and states and nations since the dawn of time. And we find this concern in an interpretation of a verse on this week's Torah portion BaMidbar. I learned this midrash from Rabbi David Kasher, from his teaching from his excellent blog, which is called Parshanut, play on Parshanut. Now, just as a reminder about our Torah portion, BaMidbar starts with a census, a counting of all Israelite men over the age of 20. This census is not truly a population study. It is a necessary step in battle preparation. We only count the men, we count them at age of service. While we rarely speak about this aspect, the early readers of the Torah were aware of the warlike atmosphere present, seeping through the verses. In BaMidbar chapter 2, after the initial counting tribe by tribe, the Parsha gives physical directions to the tribal camps of where they are to stand, where they are to root themselves, their positions ready for battle, as it were. And in this section, the text says something a bit unusual. It says in chapter 2, verse 2, the Israelites should camp, ish al diglo, each with its own flag, as a sign of their father's house. They should camp around the tent of meeting from afar, ish al diglo, each with its own flag. Most of the time I read this passage without thought, pass it over. But let's pause. There is very little mention of flags in the entire Torah, and certainly not for tribes outside of this experience. When we picture the Israelites wandering in the desert, we likely have not thought about them marching physically in this way. It's more reminiscent of a movie or a TV show, these flags that you see. So what is the purpose of these flags? What is the function of having these individual symbols of tribes within this larger collective? So this midrash that I learned from Rabbi David Kasher picks up on the strangeness of this text and gives the flags that are mentioned in the text meaning and texture. The midrash imagines each flag having a unique color and highlighting an aspect of the identity of that tribe through an image. It says Judah's flag was sky blue and the picture was a lion. Asher's was pearl colored and had the picture of an olive tree, and so on. And one can see that these flags would have been signs of great pride and individual identity. But the midrash does not stop there. Once each flag is described, the midrash imagines a conversation between Moses and God. When Moses approaches God, he is filled with worry and trepidation and anxiety because he fears that the people will become so identified with their tribe and these flags and their location that they will not be willing to serve the whole community. The midrash states, when the Holy One, blessed be, told Moses to make flags as they desired, Moses felt distressed. Moses said, now there will be future conflicts between the tribes. If I say to the tribe of Judah to camp in the north, and the same with Reuben and Ephraim and every single tribe, they might not go where they're supposed to go. What should I do? Moses asks God. As Rabbi Kasher says in this midrash, we see in Moses' anxiety a keen intuition about the perils of nationalistic fervor. It is true, the more a group becomes attached to their tribal ethnic identity, the more they tend to be insistent on their claim to a particular plot of land and are willing to fight for it. Moses is worried for good reason, Rabbi Kasher says, because flag waving in this way has often been a prelude to violence. God responds, of course, in the Midrash with assurance to Moses, saying that their sense of order and placement is based on history, going back all the way to how they walked around, how they stood around Jacob on his deathbed. The sense of order, God says, will give them pride and meaning and is not to be feared. The presence of the flags in Numbers 2 and the expansion of this idea on the Midrash lays out century-long tensions surrounding nationalism. These flags are beautiful. They are a source of pride. They connect us to history and they give us belonging. This is nationalism at its best manifestation: pride, hope, connection, and rootedness. It is generative of love and goodness. On the other hand, Moses has real reason to be anxious and concerned about the emerging tribalism within his midst, symbolized by these flags. Because when people are so proud of their tribe, it can also lead to danger. It can lead to serving narrow interests over the whole. It can, unfortunately, as we have seen through periods of history, lead to supremacy, extremism, and violence. This kind of worry of Moses, this kind of concern is rooted. It makes sense. This kind of extremism is alive and well today and taking many shapes and forms in the Middle East. There is the extremism and the horrible violence of Hamas, a terrorist organization that throws rockets on Israel, ratcheting up the violence and putting innocent lives in the crossfire. And we also have to look at the extremism that is increasing daily by the right, the ultra-nationalist groups in Israel, and by the right-wing settlers. Nearly 3 weeks, about a month ago, before this conflict was even on our minds, hundreds of ultra-right-wing Israelis stormed into East Jerusalem, an exclusively Palestinian neighborhood, screaming "Death to Arabs" and assaulting Palestinians they came across in their way. When the Al-Aqsa Mosque was infiltrated and blazes of fire were coming from the scene, not knowing what was happening up top, but seeing it from below, from the Western Wall, ultra-nationalist Jews standing there saw the fire and erupted into song, singing songs of rejoicing and celebration. They sang a song from Meir Kahane. It's even hard for me to put his name in A D'var Torah, who spoke songs, words of sweet revenge. This is and should be terrifying to all of us. And here's the thing that we have learned about extremism directly from our experience of the last 4 years in America. Extremism will always exist in corners of society. But whether or not it bubbles to the surface, whether or not it comes to the forefront and gains power, is something that is determined by those in power. I have certainly felt less fearful for my life and the Jewish community in the last several months. We know that white nationalism is not over, but is less of a threat because those in power are not tolerating it. These ultranationalists have gained such a foothold, at least in part due to the fact that those in power refuse to condemn them or silence them, in fact, giving them a platform for their grievances. And as a result, extremism supports and emboldens the most extreme positions, and the voices in the center become stifled and silenced. And no progress can be made, and then the only answer becomes an endless series of wars and conflicts. And here's another thing that we know from our own experience about extremism, that when permitted, it spreads. This week, a mosque in Coney Island was defaced with the words, "Death to Palestine." We don't even know who goes to that mosque, but someone took it upon themselves to deface that mosque. And the same thing can happen for Jewish communities as well. Unfortunately, we know this kind of extremism. So this Shabbat, I think it is vital that we ask the questions that Moshe asked and feel the worry that Moshe worried. What if people become too attached to their flag, to their nation or tribe, so that they cannot see the dignity of the other, the potential partnership of the other, that they cannot find a way out and feel that violence is the only answer to their position? How do we avert that disaster? And I answer with powerful words from my teacher and colleague, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who wrote on Facebook yesterday. Palestinians and Israeli Jews, Muslims and Christians, there is no choice but to reject the extremism, to reject the terror that comes from the government, from Hamas, from individuals, and say only together we will be able to move into a different way. There is no choice, really. We will only get there or we will collapse into the pit. There is history, there is so much pain we carry. We must learn from the pain and the history to carve out a new way forward. We must listen to the stories of hope and aspirations for building a state, just like the aspirations we heard from Fida, who spoke last week about a vision of shared society, so in contrast to what we're seeing right now, this vision that we're seeing now. A world that takes in the Jewish people as genocide consumed our people in flames. We must listen to the voices of history and future. And as we sit in silence, these are still Sharon Kleinbaum's words, and as we sit in silence, as our heart absorbs it all, we must listen to the sound of God demanding us to act justly, with kindness and with love. As I said at the beginning, we are a diverse community. But let's find a way to cry out in unison a rejection of extremism from within and from without. Let's envision a future where we can hold the divine vision of the Midrash of this week's Parsha, that our flags can be symbols of history, community, rootedness, and goodness. We have so much work to do. There's so much desire, I know, for conversation and for hope, and if people are interested, I'm happy to set up a Zoom just to have a dialogue and a conversation together. I think there's a lot weighing on all of our hearts, and so just want to take in these words and invite us to really think about that midrash and that age-old tension, that nationalism and that pride is possible for goodness, and it is also possible for the evil, and we must act in the middle. We must act for that goodness. Let us pray for peace. Let us work for dignity for all, and let us come together, regardless of what our backgrounds are or our beliefs are, and reject extremism in all forms.